So Einstein famously used a kind of operationalist methodology when he started thinking about synchronization of clocks, for example, in developing special relativity. So he wasn't, denying the importance of having a realist interpretation, but he was using kind of restricting his set of concepts to operational ones in order to make progress, in order to sort of
Right.
free himself of all the realist presuppositions of the theories that came before. So I think in quantum foundations, that's something even the realists should be using that tool. Thinking about, okay, well, what is it that we have to explain? Answer: it's the operational predictions of quantum theory. That's sort of our goal of like what we're trying to reproduce with our realist models. So Bell famously, in his theorem, connected sort of what you would see in an experiment to some deep principles about the nature of reality. Anyway, so for me, I kind of like a middle road. So realism kind of informed by operationalism, and there's a specific constraint that I want to impose on the realist interpretation. So for me, this is the most important principle in my research program, and I think most physicists appeal to this principle. It sort of shows up, and if you've done a degree in physics, you're sort of familiar with the reasoning. But strangely, we don't usually talk about it as a principle. So I call it the Leibnizian methodological principle because it goes back to Leibniz. So the way I want to articulate it, it's a version of what Leibniz called the identity of indiscernibles. So the idea is, I like to say it's the ontological identity of empirical indiscernibles. So what does that mean? Say I'm a theorist, I have some realist theory of the world, and I imagine two scenarios, two distinct physical scenarios. And I noticed that those two scenarios predict that what you would observe empirically are exactly the same. In that case, if those are considered to be ontologically distinct, like they describe different states of affairs according to my theory, I should reject that theory, because that would be a situation where you have no ability to empirically distinguish these two scenarios, and yet your theory says they're ontologically distinct. Okay, so Leibniz, for example, criticized Newton's approach with its positing of absolute space by saying, look, if I took every particle in the universe and moved it over by 5 feet in absolute space, all observational data would be exactly the same. And therefore, there isn't some real degree of freedom associated with the positions of particles in absolute space. There's only the relational degrees of freedom amongst the particles. That's the only thing that's real. Right? So there he was appealing to the principle that you should eliminate any aspects of the ontology that don't have some empirical consequence. So I think that principle shows up everywhere in physics, and we should use it. But the main reason for thinking it's a good principle, I would say, is the use that Einstein put to it. Right. So if you look at Einstein's work, I would say there's strong evidence that this was the principle that really guided him. Right? So Einstein, of course, knew about Leibniz's work, and he was influenced by Mach and Poincaré, who were big fans of Leibniz. But if you look at like his 1905 paper on special relativity, for example, so there he's criticizing ether theories, and he says, look, in the ether theory, you can imagine, say, like a coil and a bar magnet, and you can imagine the coil's at rest with respect to ether, and the bar magnet is moving. And then here's a different scenario: it's the bar magnet that's at rest with respect to ether, and the coil that's moving. And so in the case, the first case, you get a current in the coil, and it's because the time varying magnetic field that the electrons in the coil see has a force associated with it. That time varying magnetic fields introduce an electric field, which means a force on the electron, so you get a current. In the other picture, you have a static magnetic field, but now the electrons in the coil are moving through that static magnetic field, so they feel a Lorentz force, and that generates a current. But Einstein notes the current's exactly the same in the two situations. There's no way to arrange this kind of experiment in or any electromagnetic experiment that responds to anything except the relative motion of the two. So to imagine that there's some significance, some ontological significance to the actual state of motion relative to the ether is to deny Leibniz's principle. So he says we have to come up with a way of thinking about things where it's only, we have to enforce Leibniz's principle. It must be that it's only the relational motion that's important. And the formula of special relativity is Einstein's attempt to say, okay, here's how we can have a picture of reality where any two ontologically distinct scenarios correspond to empirically distinct observations. He does it again in general relativity. If you look at what's the famously his most beautiful idea, it's the equivalence principle. Following Galileo's thought experiment in a ship, but with Einstein, it's an elevator. You're on the one hand, you have an elevator that's at rest in a gravitational field associated with some acceleration. On the other hand, you have the same elevator that's accelerating through free space, absent of any gravitational fields, with a rate of acceleration that corresponds to the force of the gravitational field. And then famously, you see no differences. Any experiment you do looks exactly the same. So Einstein says, well, any theory of gravity that says that accelerating through free space and being in a gravitational field are distinct runs afoul of Leibniz's principle, because there's no empirical difference. No experiment I can do can tell the difference between those two situations. So he says we have to have a picture of reality that does away with that distinction. And that's what general relativity achieves. It says, the local curvature of space-time is exactly the same in those two circumstances, and that's all that matters for the empirical phenomena. There's one other example where, like the very last step in 1915, before he got to general relativity, he was trying to enforce general covariance, and he had this thing called the hole argument, where there was sort of diffeomorphisms you could do in just one region of space, and it looked like his theory was sort of underdetermined. That there was the predictions you would make would depend on whether this diffeomorphism had been applied or not, and so that kind of held him back. And then he suddenly realized, oh, wait a second. The only thing that's empirically significant are point coincidences, like when two particles arrive at the same point, and that is invariant under diffeomorphisms. So he suddenly realized, these diffeomorphisms, I shouldn't think of them as ontologically distinct situations, right? Because there's no empirical consequence for these things. So then when he realized that, and he said, okay, the only ontologically significant thing is sort of what's invariant under diffeomorphisms. Because of Leibniz, he wanted to enforce that. He was able to see how to impose general covariance, and then he had general relativity. So for me, this principle has been extremely effective, in the development of special and general relativity. I think it's very plausible. I think it's a great principle, for us to be using, and I think we use it all the time. So to some extent, it's the thing that I hold on to, and I want to ask the question, what interpretation of quantum theory are you led to if the principle on which you don't compromise is this Leibnizian principle? Einstein, of course, could have made very different decisions at various points when he, encountered difficulties. He could have given up on Leibniz and tried something else. So I see a lot of his success as being due to sort of never compromising on that principle. And so that's kind of dictates my research program as well, that, what do we get to if we don't want to compromise on Leibniz?
Now, are there counterexamples to this Leibniz principle?
Well, it's not a principle that you can go and test. It's rather a principle that constrains your kind of realist theories that you ought to construct for a given set of data.
Sorry, I'll give you an example.
Yep.
My understanding is that French and Redhead in 1988 or so, they showed if you have two bosons in a symmetric state, maybe you've seen this already, that they can share all their properties, that neither has some definite position and they're all symmetric under some relational properties, yet we still would call it a member of a two-particle state in Fock space and not just one.
Yeah, I think you're referring to the place in physics where people usually talk about Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles is when we're talking about particle statistics, bosons, fermions, that sort of thing. So I'm, the first thing to emphasize is I'm using it in a very different way as a kind of methodological principle for like what kinds of realist theories should you entertain. So I don't really have a strong view on what should we think about the identity of two particles. I think that's kind of a different direction in which to take Leibniz's ideas. So I'm more. I was led to it because when you study non-contextuality in quantum theory, you can ultimately justify it via Leibniz's principle. So that's sort of one of the reasons it appealed to me, that it's sort of the principle behind non-contextuality. But ultimately, it is a principle, right? So I think we can argue about whether it's something we should impose or not. It's not something we can really test. I brought up Einstein and the historical success of the principle because I think in physics, it is wise to sort of look at the history and say, what kinds of principles have tended to lead to progress? Things like, energy conservation is a great principle where, you ought not to give it up if you can avoid it. That generally progress comes by being very conservative at the principle level. Most of the principles that have proven to be effective in past physical theories survive in the new theory. And it's usually something more subtle that changes, something about the background assumptions, not these principles. So that's the spirit in which I'm using it.
So it was quantum contextuality that led you to think about this modified Leibniz principle?
Yeah, I think, I knew, I guess, something about the literature on kind of relationalism in the study of gravity, and I was sympathetic to the relationalist program, which really sort of comes from Leibniz, ultimately, Leibniz and Huygens. So I think I was already open to that, and maybe it was my sort of knowledge of, like Leibniz articulates this pretty well in the correspondence with Clarke, which is basically Newton's spokesperson. So I knew about that, and then I guess when I was studying non-contextuality, I sort of saw that same pattern, and so I made the connection, and yeah, that's that. So now I would say it's Leibniz I'm really committed to, and it's the thing that underwrites my belief in things like non-contextuality and locality and other principles. So, anyways, that's principle number one. And then maybe the second thing to say about my views on realism is that realism is kind of nebulous. Like, what counts as a realist interpretation of quantum theory? And so, where I've landed is that there's one aspect of realism that I think is important. So, this is the kind of realism I want for quantum theory, which is that correlations should have causal explanations. So, if somebody says, "Hey, there's this experiment." And there's some correlations, but I don't feel any need to answer the question of whether these two variables are correlated because one influences the other or because there's a common cause. If they just say, "No, I don't care about why," I just say they're correlated. And for me, that's a kind of anti-realism because in the context. So I spent a lot of time thinking about modeling things causally, and there's this field of research called causal inference, which people in statistics and computer science study. And if I have data that tells me taking some drug is correlated with recovering from some condition, well, that doesn't mean that the drug was effective, right? Because there are other ways of explaining that correlation. So it could be that gender influences both whether you take the drug and whether you recover. So men are more likely to recover from this condition than women are. But men are also more likely to go out and get this particular treatment or medication. So in that case, it might be that there's no causal connection at all. And when you learn that somebody took the drug, you do update your probability about whether they recovered. You say it's more likely that they recovered, but not because of the causal effectiveness of the drug. Rather, you say, well, because they took the drug, I infer that they're more likely to have been a man. And because they're a man, they're more likely to have recovered. And so that's the explanation of the correlation. So in that context, you wouldn't want to say it doesn't matter what the causal explanation is, because obviously, whether it's a common cause or cause effect entirely determines whether you would want to take this drug or not. That's really the question you want to know. Is the drug causally effective? So I think across science, what we're often looking for is causal explanations of the correlations we see. And I think it's no different in quantum theory, that to understand what's really going on, we need a causal account. And so I'm willing to give up on certain aspects of classical realism, or the conventional framework for thinking about realism. But at the end of the day, I want to insist that it has to provide causal explanations of correlations. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And ultimately, these two things are in tension with one another. So there's commitment to Leibniz's principle and wanting causal explanations of correlations. There's a strong sense in which they're in tension if you want to understand quantum theory. And that's because we have these no-go theorems that basically say, if you believe the quantum predictions are correct, and you subscribe to the conventional framework for describing realist theories. So I often call this the ontological models framework. It's sort of a picture of reality where you say, okay, variables are just things that take a set of possible values. Dynamics is basically functions. My ignorance of the values of things, well, that's described by Bayesian probability theory. And I can use that to calculate, what sorts of relative frequencies we should see in experiments. So this is, exactly the kind of thing that used to be called a hidden variable model that Bell used and Koch and Specker used in proving their no-go theorem. And what you can show is that this commitment to the Leibnizian principle, actually, it's strong enough to get you to Bell's notion of local causality, to get you to Koch and Specker's notion of non-contextuality, which we may talk about later. And so really all these no-go theorems can be thought of as, if you subscribe to the conventional framework for realism and you believe in this Leibnizian principle, you're going to get a contradiction with the quantum predictions. So what are you going to do in the face of that? So I would say a common response is to kind of give up on Leibniz, right? So when people say, let's imagine that there are superluminal influences that explain Bell inequality violations in a Bell experiment, or let's imagine that there's some hardwired context dependence in my hidden variable model, they're giving up on Leibniz. Okay, so I'm unwilling to do that. So what I would rather say is, well, there's aspects of the conventional framework for realism that we can relax. We don't have to do it the conventional way. So if all we're demanding is that we have causal explanations, correlations, we can have certain kinds of realism. They're just not going to meet they're not going to be described by the classical framework. And so that's sort of my attempt to make sense of quantum theory, is that, roughly speaking, the innovation is going to come in how we think about causation, how we think about inference, right? So those are going to be two really important elements that we need to unscramble. Like what's about reality and what's about our knowledge of reality. So the drug trial example was a really nice example of that, which is like, you want to distinguish whether learning about whether somebody takes the drug merely informs you about whether they're going to recover. So that's just inference,
right,
or whether the taking of the drug actually causes them to recover. So a lot of what I do in quantum mechanics is trying to what Jaynes called the omelet of epistemology and ontology in quantum theory. So I want to know what's about causation, what's about inference. And so roughly speaking, for me, there's going to be quantum notions of causation and inference, and they are going to be innovations relative to the classical notions of causation and inference. Much like, if you think about the notions of space and time, relativistic notions of space and time are innovations on the pre-relativistic notions. So they're still recognizably about space and time, but there's certain aspects of the conventional notions that we had to give up. And so it's similar here, that there's certain aspects of the notions of causation and inference that we're going to have to give up when we go to quantum theory.
The Economist covers math, physics, philosophy, and AI in a manner that shows how different countries perceive developments and how they impact markets. They recently published a piece on China's new neutrino detector. They cover extending life via mitochondrial transplants, creating an entirely new field of medicine. But it's also not just science. They analyze culture, they analyze finance, economics, business, international affairs across every region. I'm particularly liking their new Insider feature. It was just launched this month. It gives me a front row access to The Economist's internal editorial debates, where senior editors argue through the news with world leaders and policymakers in twice weekly long format shows. Basically, an extremely high-quality podcast. Something else you should know about is that if you go to their app, they not only have daily articles, but they also have long-form podcasts with their editors and writers. This is also available online. Whether it's scientific innovation or shifting global politics, The Economist provides comprehensive coverage beyond headlines. As a TOE listener, you get a special discount. Head over to economist.com/TOE to subscribe. That's economist.com/TOE for your discount.